We people of the West live in a society that supposedly values truth. Yet, on the one hand, you have people who swear before God to tell the truth in a court of law, who sometimes don't. And on the other hand, you have people who say that telling the truth when someone is upset is a bad thing because you'll hurt their feelings. There are people who say that they know the truth. There's people who say that they're seeking the truth. There's people who say that this is the truth and you should believe it or else. So truth is pretty important, but you have to wonder why, if everybody knows it, how can we keep bickering about it? So what is truth? Now, there's a lot of different interpretations of truth. There's a lot of different theories. But a lot of them tend to wrap themselves around the idea of relative truth. They tend to take into consideration all different kinds of societal, communal, personal aspects, which really, take the argument away from what truth has always been. Now, I'm not going to make the statement that I'm God, but if we start from the position that truth is external, if we start from the position that truth is something which is common to us all, whether we know it or not, then you start to get closer to some kind of objective truth. Now, if I were to define it, I would say that truth is that which cannot be argued against with perfect information. Truth is perfect information. If I hold up two fingers behind my back, ultimately there are two fingers behind my back. Whether I can feel my fingers there or not, whether you can see them there or not, whether or not anybody looking at me can see them there or not, there remain two fingers behind my back, and there is nothing that you can argue against it unless you are either blind in front of me or totally insane and therefore seeing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Now, from this perspective, truth is not always equal to pleasure. As a matter of fact, truth tends to be painful sometimes. But if you consider the fact that truth simply is, it is something that cannot be debated with perfect information, then really truth is independent from pleasure and pain. If it's common to us all, then you can't say that pleasure and pain at any given moment is common to anybody but a single person. So really, when you're talking about truth and when you're striving for truth, you shouldn't get caught up in this idea that we need to say something nice so we don't hurt feelings, because that isn't truth. And anybody who even has any kind of intellectual honesty with themselves could admit that. What else about truth? This external truth, this common truth. Well, for one thing, it has to be inherently rational. It always applies, and it's always right. When it is used rationally, when the information, perfect information, is used rationally, it always yields exactly what is anticipated. The results are always what you anticipated because you have perfect information. It's kind of difficult to say, how you can possibly prove that concept wrong rationally. If you take a gun that you know fires a projectile, and so long as everything in the gun is working perfectly well, you know that if you pull that trigger, a charge will be fired, and the projectile will go down the barrel, downrange. At which point it'll hit something and cause kinetic damage of some sort, depending on what kind of material it hits. That can't be debated without some kind of imperfect knowledge. Such as you don't know whether or not the gun is working. You don't know whether or not the parts are correct. You don't know whether or not the shell has a good propellant charge. You don't know the condition of the barrel, things like that. But if you knew those things, then you know exactly what will happen. Now, if that's the case, then truth is something which is ordered. Even when it seems disordered from the outside, that's only because we cannot see the order from our perspective. It reflects on the limits of your viewpoint and not on the truth itself. Now, if it's inherently ordered and rational, then it's rooted in logic. Because if it was disorder, if it was illogical, if it had no rhyme or reason, if it did not apply for whatever reason, or did apply based on no understanding, whatever, then it would probably be based on feelings, which is not necessarily a tenable position, because if it was based on feelings, then the truth is whatever you say the truth is, to not hurt feelings. Of course, if Mary Jane Watson is fat, she's fat. Anybody with eyes can see it. Perfect information. There you go. Maybe you could say that she isn't fat if you don't see her, or if all you have is a name on a piece of paper. But that's about it. She's fat. Get over it. Now, I mentioned that there's a lot of different theories, and they tend to draw on all different kinds of influences like cultural, social. It occurred to me that they aren't breaking it down in a way which enables objective truth to exist alongside these others. They do it in such a way that one truth of theirs seems to override all others, while simultaneously claiming to be this penultimate goal. So, if I were to divide truth into its constituent parts, I'd say that there's three levels of it. First is relative truth, and I would define this as whatever an individual knows, whatever they believe, and almost by necessity, whatever they think they know. It could be based on fact. It could be based on complete delusion. This includes things like mental imbalance, an inability to perceive normal things. For instance, if someone was colorblind, they can't say that the sky is blue because all they can see is a shade of something. But that's just the way that they perceive it. It's real for them in that that's what they can see, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what applies for everyone, always, under all circumstances. Regardless of whether or not a colorblind person can see the color blue in the sky, everybody around them can see the color blue, and if you reflected that light onto the colorblind person, they'd be blue. The second layer would be communal truth. Now, this would be what the pervading social narrative describes as true. It would include all scientific laws and theories. It would include the ethical bases of all religions, all ethical codes, and is essentially relative. You see, it's essentially a relative truth which is shared between individuals in some kind of group. It's not limited to one person. A bunch of people can have a consensus, but that is not a guarantee that it is perfect information. There can be a vast majority of consensus. There can be the scientific community saying that there are laws of thermodynamics, laws of gravity, but these are still limited by whatever scientific advances we have. Whether or not they are constantly observable right here on Earth and in the immediate vicinity does not always guarantee that it will be that way throughout the rest of the universe. We can observe similar things throughout the rest of the universe, but again, we haven't been there. We have limitations on what we can observe. We have limitations on the sizes of things that we can observe. We can only see things that are so small. So, you have this truth that's in the individual perspective. You have a bunch of individual perspectives lining up in a communal truth. But what I'm trying to describe here, what I'm arguing for here, is an absolute truth. Now, a lot of religions appeal to absolute truth. They equate it to God. But I would simply say that absolute truth is what is and must be. even when it's variable. For instance, if you zoomed out and said, well, in this area of the galaxy, gravity works, and in this area of the galaxy, gravity doesn't. Go figure. Well, the truth is that it works here and it doesn't here. It's not that gravity works or gravity doesn't, because those are conflicting. It is simply that all of these things are. It's impossible to argue against something like that if you have perfect information, unless you resort to delusion. Unless you flat out say, well, the law of gravity must be real, therefore that cannot be, and in the face of observable facts, other consensus, whatever, you simply say it's not there. Now, this absolute truth is easily debatable. That's not lost on me. Even basic questions like, do other things exist outside of my mind? Are other people real? Is my consciousness actually something distinct? All of those things throw hedges in the way of this. But a lot of those things can't really be answered to any satisfaction from where we are. That doesn't necessarily mean that we never can. I mean, the more we learn about the brain, the more we can define what goes on in the brain, and perhaps we might be able to start answering questions like that. For all we know, the absolute truth is that we're just basic animals, basic automatons, just running around having absolutely no idea what we're doing, and that'll simply be that. But we cannot make that argument very well right now because we simply don't have perfect information. Now, there is also the idea that there are multiple absolute truths. Now, this would, of course, suggest that the idea that there's gravity in one section and no gravity in another would be multiple absolute truths, but that's not right. Now, this is saying that there are entire realms of existence in which there are multiple absolute truths. There are places where things are totally different. That's the way they are. But if you keep zooming out, every existence, every reality we can possibly perceive and conceive, most likely conceive, every reality we can conceive must fall under the purview of absolute truth, even if the conditions in it are totally different. Because ultimately, that's the way it is. Universe A is like this, universe B is like this, universe C is like this. Perfect information across the board. In a way, even if we cannot observe different universes, there's still an all-encompassing whole. And our little reality is essentially still that communal level. Now, we could say that we're seeking absolute truth, but we'll never know whether or not this is the boundary unless we push it. It is entirely possible we will never be able to explore alternate realities, even if we can detect that they exist. But until we get to the point where it can be absolutely proven, we'll never know. Now, I ask myself, what do enlightened governments, religions, and different philosophies all have in common? Well, the thing they have in common is that they're appealing to truth. You see, governments have to appeal to truth when legislating. It's the basis of their legitimacy. Whether or not that truth derives from God, or natural law, or some utilitarian factoid which fits in nicely with their agenda, they have to appeal to truth. Nobody would want to push through a law, no rational person anyway, would want to push through a law which is based on something that is patently false. No one would want to drop a law banning oxygen because it makes grass grow and grass is evil. It's totally inconsistent. It might, it might grow grass, but why would you do that? Is grass bad? Is oxygen bad? Don't we need oxygen? Well, so they appeal to truth. If they didn't appeal to truth, it would be totally irrational, and the government would collapse because it would